President Xi Jinping's New Year address to China. What was his message? And what's ahead for China in 2023? Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered his 2023 New Year's address to China on Saturday, reflecting on what China achieved in 2022 and also looking to the future. We begin with this report from Beijing.
President Xi has sent his greetings to the Chinese people. He first talked about the country's development path to build a stronger China.
擘画了全面建设社会主义现代化国家，以中国式现代化全面推进中华民族伟大复兴的宏伟蓝图，吹响了奋进新征程的时代号角。
President Xi said the Chinese economy has remained the second largest in the world and enjoyed sound development, with its GDP for 2022 expected to exceed 120 trillion yuan. In 2022, China has secured a bumper harvest for the 19th year in a row, despite a global food crisis, and consolidated gains in poverty alleviation and rural revitalization. China has continued its effort to fight against the pandemic in 2022. Xi said China has adapted its COVID response in light of the evolving situation to protect the life and health of the people. He spoke highly of the efforts made by officials and the general public, particularly medical professionals and community workers.
我们战胜了前所未有的困难和挑战，每个人都不容易。目前，疫情防控进入新阶段，仍是吃劲儿的时候，大家都在坚韧不拔努力，曙光就在前头，大家再加把劲儿，坚持就是胜利。 团结就是胜利。
2022 has been a year full of achievements. The Beijing Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games concluded with a resounding success. And China's Shenzhou spacecraft soared into the heavens, a big step in the country's space exploration.
中国空间站全面建成，我们的太空之家遨游苍穹。
The president also reviewed some other achievements made throughout the year. The launch of China's third aircraft carrier, Fujian, the delivery of China's first large passenger aircraft, C919, and the Baihetan hydropower station went into full operation. Xi said China is a country brimming with vigor and vitality, with various pilot free trade zones in the Hainan Free Trade Port, coastal areas, central and western regions, the northeast, and the border regions, all developing at their own paces. When recalling his visit to Hong Kong, Xi expressed his confidence in Hong Kong and Macau to enjoy long-term prosperity and stability under one country, two systems. The president also mentioned his communication with friends across the world over the past year and stressed China's close link with the world.
我们始终如一，珍视和平和发展。 始终如一，珍惜朋友和伙伴，坚定站在历史正确的一边，站在人类文明进步的一边，努力为人类和平与发展事业贡献中国智慧、中国方案。
Unity is one of the key words in President Xi's speech. He called on the country's 1.4 billion people to work with one heart and one mind and build consensus through communication and consultation.
海峡两岸一家亲，衷心希望两岸同胞相向而行，携手并进， 共创中华民族绵长福祉。
Saying youth are filled with vigor and a source of hope, Xi expressed the country's great expectations of its younger generation. He encouraged the youngsters to step forward and take on their responsibilities. And finally, Xi also extended his wishes of peace and happiness to people from across the globe.
Okay, now to discuss all of this, we are joined from New York by Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Also joining us in this discussion from Honolulu, Hawaii, is Yan Liang. She is a chair professor of economics at Willamette University. And with us from Shanghai, Josef Gregory Mahoney. He is professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. And here in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Sourabh Gupta. He is a senior Asia-Pacific international relations policy specialist with the Institute for China-America Studies. To all of you, firstly, let me be the latest, wishing you all a Happy New Year, and on to the discussion. Victor, I want to begin with you. Let's take a look at this speech from President Xi, really trying to set the tone, not only looking ahead to 2023, but also looking back at 2022. A nice mix of both. And he talked about China's development and the road to building a stronger future. I want to know from you what you think about 2022, where China is poised from a global perspective on so many issues, and how you think they are poised moving into this new year.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, Happy New Year to you and to your global audience. I think indeed, just like President Xi Jinping indicated in his New Year's speech, 2022 was a year of great events and great significance as far as China is concerned. And also, it was a very, very important year as far as China's engagement with the rest of the world. Now, President Xi Jinping listed a whole range of major achievements, and I think we all listened very carefully, and we are reminded of how important these major achievements are. Let me give you one example. This completion of the Chinese space station is very important because either by 2023 or 2024, the Chinese space station will be the only space station in orbit. And that will be very important not only for China, but for mankind as a whole. Now, secondly, I think 2022 saw at the very end of the year in October, the completion of the 20th Party Congress. That was a major important event in China and for the rest of the world, because China now has one of the most united government in the whole world. And this poised China well for 2023. Now, also keep in mind, China made a major shift to the zero COVID policy, which China practiced for 3 years with great success in terms of minimizing deaths and minimizing infections. Now, under the new paradigm, we need to really live with the COVID. And China is in this transition, exactly as President Xi Jinping emphasized. It's still challenging, and I hope eventually we will go through this wall of fire and emerge on the other side successful and triumphant. So we are very confident about 2023, and we are very much reminded of the challenges and the great successes China made as a whole for 2022.
Okay, Victor, we're going to dissect all of those as we move on, but I want to bring Yan Liang in and talk specifically about the economic challenges. China, of course, the second greatest economic power in the world, and if you listen to experts, of sometime within the next decade or so, it probably will be number one. President Xi noting that the Chinese economy has enjoyed sound development, said GDP is expected to grow or exceed, 120 trillion yuan. Also saying, and using his words, it enjoys strong resilience. Where do you think the Chinese economy is positioned right now? It really didn't suffer from the punishing effects of inflation that so much of the rest of the world did this past year.
Absolutely. Happy New Year to you, Sean, and your team. So I think it's important to note that 2022 has been an uneasy year as far as the economy is concerned, because the government has done a terrific job in balancing protecting people's lives and health with economic resilience and stability. So this past year, the GDP growth rate has been relatively low compared to the historical average. That said, I think President Xi Jinping has pointed out the economic fundamentals are still sound. We still have, young people who are ready to go back to the jobs. We still have a lot of technological breakthroughs, especially in, manufacturing, in services sector. We still have, a lot of sectors that are booming when it comes to, for example, foreign direct investment has gone into high-tech sector, and that has gone up by 30% this year. So I think overall the economy has been resilient, although there are some bumpy roads ahead now that we have recalibrate the COVID measures. But I think after a swift period, we're looking at strong economic rebound led by consumption demand, investment demand, and also strong export performance. And you're right, inflation has not hit China very much, and I think that is a very important, funding, a very good ground for next year's economic rebound.
Victor, I want you to take another stab at talking about COVID as well, because chronicling what's gone on in China over the past 3 years, we've done that to a great extent. But let's talk about the new challenges that President Xi says the country is facing. And as you mentioned, they really did everything in the past to minimize the fatality rate within China. When you're talking about 1.4 million people, and at best about 70% of them maybe received a vaccine, that's important. So where is the country now? Where is it headed? And how will it be affected in the start of 2023?
Yeah, this is a very important question. For 3 years since the outbreak of the pandemic, until, let's say, late October or the month of November, China vigorously practiced a zero COVID policy, meaning the government would take actions and leave no stone unturned to discover infections and then to quarantine, to weed out all the infections, for example, try to create a national environment of zero COVID. Now, this is unprecedented in human history, and no other countries could do this or could have the national will or resources to do it. China did this for 3 years with the full recognition of the tremendous amount of cost to its economic development, and also, unfortunately, at very great inconvenience to many people throughout China. Now, China decided to lift almost all the restrictions, and China declared that they no longer consider COVID-19 as a pandemic. They consider the COVID-19 as infections, downgrading the government-required treatment to the COVID cases to a much lower level. Now, this is very much welcomed because the Western countries and the rest of the world have been demanding that China open up. However, there will be a process, there will be a transition, because right now, China is experiencing large number of infections, and very unfortunately, there are elderly people and other people with pre-existing diseases who unfortunately pass away. I want to use this occasion to express my condolences to those families who have relatives passing away, and also to express my best wishes to all those who are suffering from positive cases. However, we are confident we will go through this period of transition. That is, go through this wall of fire and eventually normalize the relations between China and the rest of the world. And China will be opening up its door to welcome all visitors from foreign countries, and the Chinese travelers will resume their extensive travels throughout the world. This will be the hopeful tomorrow that we will be looking forward to.
Okay, I want to move on. Joseph, I want to bring you in now. One thing I think everybody across the world looked at this year, no matter where you are, was the success that China had with its space program. Now having its space station operational, having so many successful launches, and the activity that did go on in space, coupling up, creating this space station now that is, by all accounts, simply working in an amazing fashion. What does this space technology do for China? I mean, you have to talk about just the national pride as well, but in a country that is just making all kinds of unparalleled progresses in artificial intelligence and technology, this is certainly another feather in their cap.
That's right. I think, you have to go back to the history. One of the big historical factors driving China's space program It's not simply that China is a modern nation that's looking to go out and to explore the unknown like other leading nations, but the fact that China was deliberately excluded from joining the International Space Station by orders of the United States. So, as a result, China was compelled by these circumstances to take its own path. And it's done this with great success. So I think this is the first point to recall. The second is, the context that we see from this past year, 2022, where the United States has made it clear that its objective is to try to limit China's technological advances whenever and wherever possible. So when we see China scoring major victories in space exploration and space development, and as Victor noted, we'll have the one station operating in the near term. It's something that I think many people in China should take pride in, but more than just the publicity value of it, understand that it's a demonstration of moving forward technologically, despite these tremendous headwinds and pressures from the United States.
And to put that into perspective, it's not that the U.S. turned its back on it. There is a law preventing NASA from working with China. This is carved in stone. And privately, many NASA people told me in passing that they wished that wasn't the case. But so many conservative lawmakers here. So, Joseph, that's going to be down the road. Sourabh, I want to turn to you. Sorry to bring you so late into the program, but this is an important question. Let's talk about where China is in terms of a global audience, in terms of the various conflicts. We have to talk about what's going on in Ukraine right now, and also just the wall that has been put up between the United States and China over the last 5 or 6 years. How important is China going to be to firstly, the ongoing fighting going on in Ukraine, and secondly, do you see any reason that there could be a thaw in relations between China and the United States?
Let me get to the second part first. I'm actually an optimist in 2023 with regard to the US-China relationship. I think the meeting in Bali was very useful between President Xi and President Biden. I would say during the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, yes, the US-China relations were nowhere close to what the Chinese hoped it would return to in terms of normality. But I would say there was a steady progression. There was 2 steps forward, 1 step back at some points of time, wherein they were trying to sort some of the issues out. There was progress, incremental progress made, but there were also a lot of other pressures which came on, including Speaker Pelosi's trip. But I thought the meeting in Bali went off very well. I think it creates a window of opportunity in 2023. I think both sides are ready to seize that opportunity. I don't want to exaggerate what will come out of that. What will happen in 2023 in terms of US-China relations going into the presidential election in 2024. I'm sure the Republicans are going to raise the ante on China in Congress and elsewhere.
China bashing becoming popular once again.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that as then Foreign Minister Wang Yi characterized, President Biden made some important commitments in his conversations with President Xi. He talked about the 5 no's. The U.S. doesn't seek a Cold War with China, doesn't seek conflict with China. Its alliances are not geared against China, does not wish to compete, does not wish to bring down the Chinese system, etc., etc. So I think we need to see if these words can now be given substance in 2023, and I think that opportunity exists. And I mean, if President Biden can get reelected, I think that opportunity will be that much more deeper in a second term, but that's still very far away.
Yeah, indeed, it is far away. And I want to bring Victor in real quickly, because it seemed like we just digested the midterm elections, and now everybody's gearing up for the general election. Internationally, it must be quite confusing to a lot of people that the U.S. is so focused on that. But how important is this going to be to have a certain degree of symmetry moving forward and having relations move in a positive way? How closely do you think China is watching what's going to unfold the next 2 years in the U.S.?
Well, first point, since 2017, despite of a lot of headwind from Washington against China-U.S. constructive and friendly relations, China-U.S. trade has been breaking records again and again. So that means there are underlying dynamics supporting China-US exchanges. That's number one. Number two is that in the shorter term, that is 2023, all the way up to, let's say, 2029, I'm personally very optimistic about China-US relations. I'm afraid China-US relations probably will get worse before it will get better. However, starting from, let's say, 2029 to 2030 and beyond, I'm very confident that China-US relations will become more and more normalized. Allow me to make one point. There was a theory in the United States talking about a destined to war, which I completely rebuke. I've come up with my own theory. It's called the inevitable peace, because the destined to war theory drew experiences from wars, which were all conventional wars. But China and the United States are two large nuclear weapon countries. There should be no option at all that China and the United States should have a war against each other. Therefore, whether China and the United States like each other or not, that's another issue. But I believe that there will be inevitability of peace between China and the United States. And the tipping point will be somewhere around 2030. Why? Because I'm pretty sure, as many economists in the world do, that around 2030, the size of the Chinese economy will surpass that of the United States. And the United States will still remain the largest superpower in the world, because China has no desire at all to replace the United States as the next superpower in the world. China and the United States will need to get along with each other, despite of their differences. And I'm confident that both China and the United States will have enough wisdom to overcome their differences and decide to get along with each other. So 2030 will be the tipping point.
Liang, I want to bring you in to get your take on how important the economic ties are. It seems that in so many ways, the nation's kind of cut off their nose to spite their face with all these tariffs back and forth, and who really benefited from this in the end. Do you see the same positive that some of our other guests do in moving forward in the relations between China and the U.S., especially from an economic standpoint?
Well, I think, I totally agree with Victor Gao, which I think, both sides are interested in putting the guardrails to both sort of countries' relationships, not to turn that competition into some sort of conflict. However, I think when it comes to the economy or the economic ties, we have seen some mixed signals. On the one hand, for example, the public company oversight board has recently just got access to China's, listing the company's files and personnel. So that diffused the risk of mass delisting of the Chinese companies on the U.S. equity market. So that is a silver lining. But on the other hand, we have heard recently, for example, USTR Catherine Tai talked about that the punitive tariffs are not going to go down unless China changes behaviors, or they need more toolkits to deal with China's quote unquote unfair practices. So I think that the tariff war seems to be continue to wage on. And as we also know that Janet Yellen, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, she was once a strong advocate for removing the tariffs. But then recently, as we have heard from her, she's really strongly advocate for the so-called friendshoring. So in other words, I think that's an indication that the Biden administration is going to continue with the so-called tech war, trying to move those tech companies from China and move them to, India or Mexico. So that is definitely not a good sign for the so-called recoupling or, some sort of technological collaborations. And finally, I think it's interesting to note, as we all know, that, Biden administration is now looking at the 2024 election.
Right.
So there's no political will to really sort of cave in on those economic fronts.
Sourabh, I'm sorry again to come to you so late in the program. There's been so much to talk about. But I want to get your take on one thing that these two nations have been focused on together, and that is the environment. Where do you think that is going, and how important is it going to be for these two nations, in essence, be kind of joined at the hip, saying we need to control carbon emissions, we need to do all we can to control the planet from warming up terribly in the coming decades?
I think that is going to be part of the opportunity that we see in 2023. there was already a sliver of cooperation, on global methane between the two sides. This was in November itself, at the time when President Xi and President Biden were meeting and COP27 was happening. Climate change is one of those areas where the working groups are slated to take matters forward. So I can foresee that there is going to be progress on that front. Both, I think, at the state level, at the U.S. state levels, they're already working with multiple Chinese players. But at the central government level, at the federal government level, there has not been that much communication. I anticipate a lot more communication this year. But I would say that the real opportunity for China on climate change is actually with the Europeans, because China's policy framework in many ways is mimicking the European policy framework in the areas of climate change, emissions trading, et cetera. And as China deepens that institutional framework, it creates great opportunities to kind of make that complementary to the Europeans. There are areas where there is friction, that the Europeans want to have tariffs on energy intensive goods, et cetera. There isn't a consensus on that, but I would submit that there's a lot more commonality in approaches by the EU and by China, which can institutionally get linked up. And this will be very supportive of climate change. And I think the Americans also, especially with passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the investments that they're making in the climate change area, can be a win-win for all, right, even if they all are not tied together and working together. They're all pushing in the same direction, I would say.
Joseph, I hate to do this to you. You got about 35 seconds. Tell me why you think that Sourabh is correct.
Well, the thing that I'm most concerned about is that we haven't talked much about is the possibility of a global economic recession this year, and certainly others have noted the headwinds, the likely political headwinds from the United States that will face China. But above all, I think Xi Jinping is right that China has sound fundamentals. But the thing we have to recall is that the Chinese system is one that is built to survive and thrive in crises. And it may be that if we encounter a global recession, that as we did after the first major contraction associated with COVID, that China may once again lead the world out of it.
Great. I want to thank all our guests, beginning with Joseph, Victor, as well as Sourabh, and of course, Liang, who drew the short straw and had to come in from Hawaii for us today. Thank you very much. It has been a wonderful discussion. Again, thanks for joining us here on another edition of The Heat. Stay tuned. Mike Walters coming up next with a wrap of all of the day's news.